The valley had grown quiet in recent years. Once a place where harvest bells rang and children ran through rows of sun-gold corn, the soil now coughed dust, and the wind carried no laughter. Farms sat brittle with rot, animals died without reason, and mothers held their infants tighter as if waiting for something nameless to knock on their doors. When Reverend Josiah Greaves arrived in the spring of 1835, no one questioned the providence of his coming. He looked neither poor nor wealthy, neither young nor old, but had a face that invited trust. His eyes held a pale gray calm, and when he smiled, it was the kind of smile people hadn't seen in years. Not from strangers, not even from family. He introduced himself as a man called by grace and gently insisted the church be restored, brick by brick, not just with hands, but with hearts. No one remembered who funded the new stained glass or where the pews had come from, but they appeared in weeks. Services resumed. People returned. Josiah's sermons weren't loud or theatrical. He didn't scream about fire or punishment. He spoke low and slow, with stories that felt older than Scripture and yet somehow more intimate. He spoke of forgiveness that felt like a balm and of heaven as a place with no doors, only light. Those who came in angry left softened. Those who'd long since stopped believing began humming hymns again without realizing. When one man struck his wife during a drunken rage, Josiah visited him privately. A week later, the man gave up drinking, wept in church, and swore he saw angels in a dream. The town began to change, the crops stayed dry, but the people looked fed. A calm, unspoken order took root. Not fear, not joy, but stillness. Stillness is like the kind that lives in cellars. Beneath the chapel there had always been a basement, though most had forgotten. An old coal room sealed decades ago, its original use long dismissed. Josiah asked for the key soon after his arrival. The mayor, assuming it was to store supplies, handed it over with little thought. No one saw the Reverend enter it, and no one thought to ask what now lay behind that rusted iron door. But strange things began to happen after it reopened. Animals avoided the church perimeter, circling but never crossing. Children who played near the chapel's rear steps often returned sick with fevers. Some swore they heard low chanting under the floorboards at night, not in English, not in Latin, just rhythm. But when asked, Josiah would smile and say the church was just settling its foundation. The oddities were easy to ignore because the Reverend made himself indispensable. He taught reading to those who never learnt. He visited the elderly without being asked. He helped bury the dead with hands that never trembled. And when one mother lost her child to fever, Josiah sat beside her for 3 days without sleeping. He didn't pray loudly. He just held her hand until her sobbing stopped. People began calling him the shepherd, and it stuck. But it was the eyes that lingered. No one could quite remember their color. Sometimes pale, sometimes deep, always distant. He looked at people the way one might look at livestock, kindly without malice, but with the quiet authority of someone who had already counted the flock and knew which ones would not return. The church began holding evening services, not listed, not announced, just quiet gatherings lit by candlelight, always finishing just before midnight. Only certain townsfolk were invited. Those who attended never spoke of them, only saying they felt lighter afterward. But one woman, Miriam, who declined an invitation due to her newborn's colic, found her door nailed shut the next morning with 7 black feathers hanging from its lintel. She left the valley within a week, and still the chapel grew, not in size but in weight. You could feel it like it was sinking into the earth. The air inside smelt of lilies and iron. The stained glass windows sometimes shimmered without sunlight. A child once whispered that the glass didn't show saints, it showed watchers. When his father struck him for lying, Josiah visited their home that evening. The boy never spoke again, but he clung to Josiah's hand like it was the only thing keeping him on earth. No one noticed the altar had changed. At first it was small details, a crack in the wood filled with something red and hardened, a new cloth that felt waxy and warm. Then one day the altar was just different, larger. The original had been replaced, though no one remembered when. Its new surface was carved with spirals that looked almost like letters but didn't belong to any written language. When someone asked Josiah about the design, he said it was a blessing, a sign that the church had been chosen. He never said by whom. And beneath it all, behind the sealed cellar door, something waited, not impatient, not hungry. Just a present, as if it had always been there, as if Josiah hadn't brought it but only reminded it of what it once was. And now the town was listening again. James Ogle had never trusted faith. He trusted numbers. He ran the general store with exactness, noting down every pound of salt, every inch of fabric, and every copper exchanged for milk or barley. His ledger was cleaner than scripture, and unlike most in the hollow, he kept 2 copies, one for the counter and one in his locked chest at home. He wasn't a godly man, but he tithed anyway, out of routine more than belief. So when he reviewed the church's tithe list pinned to the chapel bulletin, he noticed something off. Not at first, but in how often names repeated. The Ramseys had paid for 3 months, but their farm had gone dark since midsummer. The Pritchards gave a large sack of wheat in October, yet no one had seen their eldest daughter at school since September. In all, 7 family names kept appearing on the church rolls. But no one had seen those families. Not at market, not at funerals, not even at the harvest fair. James copied the list and matched it to his own. His fingers went cold as he saw the pattern stretch back further than he thought. The names didn't just vanish. They were being marked as present in offerings long after their homes had gone silent. He asked around carefully. Most people responded with tired shrugs, saying Reverend Greaves had already explained it. Some kind of sickness, a lung rot spreading through the southern slope. The families were quarantined in their homes under the Reverend's care. No need to panic, no need to visit, just prayers. But James remembered the last real sickness, years ago when half the town had boils and the others buried the ones who didn't recover. That time doctors came. That time fires burnt to disinfect clothes. This time, nothing. No one had seen any physician ride into town. No one had seen carriages leave the infected homesteads. Only Josiah Greaves. James took the ledger to the sheriff, a weary man named Harlan Dake. Dake listened, eyes narrowed, but then leaned back and rubbed his temple like swatting away a mosquito. He said Reverend Greaves had everything under control. Said the man had medical training from his time abroad, missionary work, or something like it. Said the Reverend had personally sent him a sealed letter explaining the illness, the need for isolation, and the importance of spiritual rest. He told James not to stir up fear where healing was already happening. But healing didn't explain why no one had heard from the Pritchards' youngest son, who used to run errands for sugar. It didn't explain why the chimney smoke from the Ramsey farm had stopped. It didn't explain why fresh tithe baskets kept arriving from houses no one could get close to. James Ogle walked home through the dying light with the copy of names in his coat. That night, something knocked gently on his door. Just once. Then silence. The next morning his store ledger was missing, but nothing else had been touched. Only a single item had been added to the church's tithe board. Ogle, in trust. The church felt fuller than ever, but it was a strange fullness, not like before when laughter spilt through the aisles or when restless children had to be hushed during hymns. Now every service was quiet, obedient, and unnaturally still. Reverend Greaves began urging those he called the afflicted to sit in the back pews close to the altar curtain. He said it was to protect them from drafts, to keep them warm and close to prayer. No one argued. His voice made things sound reasonable even when they weren't. But something about the way he phrased it, always the afflicted, never names, lingered in the air like the smell of overripe lilies that now lined the sanctuary steps. People sat up front with folded hands and downcast eyes, but curiosity clawed its way through politeness. Some began stealing glances over their shoulders during scripture, half expecting to see their sick neighbors nodding in agreement or at least shifting in their seats. But the rows behind the altar curtain remained perfectly still. No coughs, no clearing of throats, not even the creak of old wood under weight. The silhouettes never moved. They sat frozen, not stiff like soldiers, but slack, like mannequins balanced just right. And they never left first. Each time Reverend Greaves would step forward, raise his hand for the congregation to bow their heads, and by the time they looked up, the back rows were empty. Whispers grew in the village, but they didn't rise to protest. They murmured only when safe, in kitchens and barns, always after glancing toward the chapel as if it had ears. Some believed the sick were being sedated. Others wondered if they were even alive. But no one asked the Reverend directly. His smile remained the same, calm, assuring, pure. He preached of stillness as a form of holiness, of how the soul learns best when the body is quiet. He told stories of ancient prophets who lay in caves for 40 days, listening to the voice of God through stone and shadow. He never lied outright. He just bent the meaning until it snapped. One Sunday, a little girl dropped her doll near the back pews as the Reverend spoke. She broke from her mother's side and slipped toward the curtain. In the breathless pause that followed, only one thing moved. Not her, not the figures, but something behind the curtain. A twitch, a shift, as if something had reached forward, not to return the doll, but to stop her from leaving. Josiah was at her side in seconds, scooping her up gently, smiling to the congregation. He said the poor child had fainted from heat, but those close enough swore she hadn't cried. She hadn't blinked. She just stared at the space behind the curtain with a face full of something no child should ever wear. Not fear, not confusion, but recognition. At the next service, the doll appeared on the pulpit, folded in prayer. When the front pew began to slope, Reverend Greaves asked the village carpenter, Elias Burrows, to repair the flooring beneath the pulpit. Elias was a quiet man, known more for his calloused hands than his words, and he worked alone with the kind of precision that didn't welcome conversation. He arrived early with tools wrapped in cloth and a thin journal tucked beneath his coat. The chapel was empty that morning, lit only by the pale light slipping through warped glass. Elias began pulling up warped panels, whistling low under his breath until the sound caught in his throat. Beneath the third board, embedded deep into the foundation beam, were 2 rusted iron rings, not decorative, not structural, functional. Shackles, the kind used to tether limbs, the kind he'd seen once before years ago during a transport job down south. They were bolted tight, looped with dry remnants of frayed leather. The wood surrounding them was dark, not just from rot, but from something that had soaked in. Not recent, but not old enough to forget. He said nothing to the Reverend. He kept working, steady hands betraying the sickness in his gut. That night he walked to the magistrate's home with a sketch he'd made of the bolts and the placement beneath the pulpit. He didn't accuse, just reported as a man of trade might. But the magistrate barely looked up from his ledger. He said the church was under divine jurisdiction, not civil, and warned Elias about spreading fear in uncertain times. 2 nights later, the sky turned orange. Flames danced across Elias's roof like devils in celebration. and by the time neighbors arrived, the house was gone. No bodies were found, but no one saw Elias again. Only his charred tools remained, laid out neatly in a line on the ash-covered path that led away from the chapel. The village called it an accident, a loose stovepipe, bad luck. But not one person asked where the carpenter had gone. Not one person knocked on the church door. That Sunday, Reverend Greaves stood at the pulpit, his voice soft, his eyes wet. He spoke of Elias with deep affection, calling him a man of honest hands and silent burdens. He quoted scripture about the fire that purifies the soul, and how some are taken early not as punishment but as preparation. He smiled gently and said Elias had found peace, and the congregation nodded like cattle hearing a familiar bell. But beneath the new boards, bolted tighter than before, the iron rings remained. No one checked. No one dared. And from the floor above, the pulpit now stood straighter than it ever had. Solid, steady, as if anchored by something beneath that knew how to hold still. The storm came without warning, a crack of thunder tearing open the hills just past nightfall. Wind whipped through the valley like it wanted to scrape flesh from bone, and the rain struck sideways, thick and cold enough to blind. Most homes bolted their shutters and prayed, but one man arrived too late for shelter. A traveler, boots thick with road dust, his coat clinging to him like wet paper. He was a stranger. No one remembered his name, only that he was polite, soaked to the bone, and grateful when Reverend Greaves offered him refuge in the church for the night. The chapel was warm. A fire burnt low in the hearth. The pews gleamed with oil and candle wax. The man curled near the front row, his boots set neatly beside him, his head resting on a folded coat. He closed his eyes beneath the high ceiling and let the storm fade to a whisper behind thick stone walls. But sleep didn't come easily. The stillness was too sharp, like the air was waiting for something to happen. He tossed. He turned. Then, sometime near midnight, he heard it. Not thunder, not wind. Music, but not like any music he'd heard before. It came from beneath the altar, low and wavering as though muffled by thick earth. It was a hymn, but broken. Voices sang the same tune but at different tempos, out of step with one another, drifting in and out like breath in a sick room. They didn't rise, they didn't fall, they simply murmured, pressing in like mist. He sat up, staring at the altar. The curtain behind it moved slightly, not from wind but from something slower, like lungs expanding. The voices didn't chant, they begged, not in words but in rhythm, like something trapped that had forgotten how to ask for help. Each voice cracked against the stone floor like it had no mouth left. He stood slowly, stepping toward the pulpit, toward the place where the sound felt thickest. His bare feet met the polished wood. One more step, and the hymn stopped, not faded, stopped, as if whatever sang had turned its attention upward. In the morning, the storm had passed. The sun cut across the chapel in clean golden lines. The hearth was cold, the pews were dry, the traveler was gone. His boots sat where he'd left them, perfectly placed beneath the front row. His coat was folded, undisturbed, but a dark streak trailed along the grain of the pew behind him, soaked through the seam where the back met the seat. Dried blood, not pooled, not split, absorbed. Reverend Greaves found it first. He spoke gently to the cleaning women that morning, saying the stranger must have moved on, grateful for the shelter. He praised God for guiding him through the valley, then placed one of the boots at the chapel's entrance for the next weary soul in need. The other, he claimed, had been stolen by a fox. No one asked why only one pew smelt like rust and iron. No one asked why the stone near the pulpit felt warmer than the rest. That evening, after the sunset service, the congregation filed out as usual. But one girl, the same who'd once dropped her doll near the back rows, paused at the door and looked up at the altar. Her lips moved without sound, repeating something she had not been taught. Her mother pulled her gently away, and the girl followed without protest. But that night in her sleep, she hummed something that made the windows sweat and the dog refused to enter her room. And inside the chapel, behind the curtain, the wood beneath the pulpit swelled slightly, as if something old had been fed. When the leaves began to fall and the breath of morning turned to frost, Reverend Greaves announced the first feast of faith. It was to be a celebration of gratitude, he said, a ritual of renewal for the town's spirit. No one questioned why it had never been done before. His voice made even new things feel ancient. The food, he claimed, would be provided entirely by the church's own garden, a small patch of land tucked behind the chapel where weeds had once choked the ground and nothing of use had grown in years. Yet now rows of vegetables rose in perfect lines, green and full, while the rest of the valley lay brittle with drought. The fields beyond town remained dust, the livestock gave less milk, but behind the chapel, fat gourds bulged from the earth and tomatoes bled color so rich it stained the fingertips. No one had seen who tended the soil. No one heard tools clatter or saw footsteps in the dirt. Still, each week the harvest expanded, as though fed by something deeper than water or sun. The feast was held at dusk. Long tables lined the chapel yard, and Reverend Greaves walked between them with his sleeves rolled and his hands clasped, offering blessings over every dish. Roasted squash, boiled potatoes, pickled roots, all laid out in equal portions. Each plate is the same, each spoonful is exact. He said it was important that no one waste what was sacred. The villagers ate quietly, not with joy but with reverence. The food had an odd warmth to it, like it had been cooked not by fire but by fever. The texture was soft and easy to chew, and it slid down the throat like broth. No one complained. They left full, some even radiant, claiming to feel lighter, as though forgiven of something they hadn't known they carried. But the widow Langley, who had refused to eat at the public table, took her portion home instead. She'd lost 2 sons that year, one to fever, the other to the mine collapse, and she hadn't spoken more than a sentence since. That night she sat alone at her kitchen table and slowly ate the entire plate by herself. No candle was lit, no grace was said. When her neighbor found her the next morning, she was slumped over the table, fingers clawed at her stomach, eyes open and clouded with red. Her mouth was stretched, jaw locked wide, as though something had forced itself out rather than in. The coroner, when he arrived, found nothing inside her stomach but fine white powder. No food, no bile, just dust. At her funeral, Reverend Greaves delivered a gentle sermon about humility and communion. He reminded the village that healing can look like suffering and that sacrifice, when made in silence, echoes forever. He never mentioned the feast again, but the garden behind the chapel doubled in size before the first snowfall, and that winter no one in the valley starved. But no one asked what the soil had eaten first. Jonah Bell had never meant to become an undertaker. He was 16, thin and pale, with hands too shaky for farming and eyes too sharp for comfort. When old Mortimer Hales took him on as an apprentice, it was more out of necessity than kindness. The town had grown quiet, but the dead kept coming. Fewer births, more burials, and yet fewer coffins than expected. Most families now delivered their dead directly to the church, where Reverend Greaves said he performed ritual washings before final rest. Mortimer didn't argue. He just drank more. But Jonah watched. He saw the empty graves, the closed caskets, and the missing paperwork. And he saw how the Reverend's garden always flourished a day or 2 later. One night, with Mortimer passed out and the wind howling like it remembered something awful, Jonah slipped from the undertaker's porch and crossed the dark field to the church. He had no key, but the chapel doors were never locked. He crept down the aisle past the pulpit that now seemed to hum even when empty, and found the iron hatch that led to the cellar. It groaned when opened. The air that rose from it was not damp, not mildewed. It was dry and hot, like a furnace that hadn't cooled. He descended slowly, step by step, until the candle in his shaking hand cast light on the floor below. The cellar was bigger than he expected. Stone walls stretched farther than the chapel above. The shelves were lined with bottles of what looked like oil, cloths folded too precisely, and bones. At first he thought they were animal remains, stripped and sorted, arranged by type. Then he saw the femurs, human, every one of them. Dozens, perhaps more, stacked carefully like firewood. Each bore tiny marks etched along the length, symbols that didn't belong to any language Jonah knew. Curves and spirals, not carved in rage, but with steady, intelligent hands. He stepped closer, and the floor clicked beneath him, not in sound, but in sensation. It gave slightly. He knelt and brushed away a thin layer of dirt. Beneath was a trap door, warped with age but recently oiled. He pulled it open and saw the pit. Bones, layer upon layer. Hollowed skulls stacked like offerings, each cut clean through the crown with surgical precision. No burn marks, no decay. They were preserved as if handled daily. Some were still damp, some were tiny. One jaw near the edge still had a child's molar loose in its socket. Jonah reached for it, but the moment his fingers brushed the enamel, he heard something shift in the darkness. Not footsteps, breathing, but not from one place, from everywhere at once. He fled without taking anything. The trapdoor slammed behind him as if forced. He ran past the pulpit, past the empty pews, past the altar that now seemed to watch him. He didn't stop until he reached Mortimer's house, where he locked himself in the shed and didn't speak until morning. The next day, he told Mortimer everything. But Mortimer didn't believe him, or pretended not to. Later that week, Reverend Greaves stopped by with fresh bread and a donation envelope. Jonah disappeared the following day. His bed was empty. His tools are gone. Only his candle remained, set in the center of the undertaker's table, burnt down to the base. And in the cellar beneath the church, a new set of bones was added. Small, young, still warm. When winter sank its teeth into the valley, the sermons began to change. Reverend Greaves still preached of light and grace, but now his voice lingered longer on the subjects of discipline, of obedience, and of the sacredness of suffering. He said the flesh was a veil through which truth could only be glimpsed in stillness, and that stillness was bought not with comfort but with submission. He called it the doctrine of pain, though he never used the word pain directly. He cloaked it in softer terms: purification, refinement, blessed endurance. But the message was clear. Those who suffered would see. Those who listened without needing to speak would be chosen. He told the congregation that Christ had not just died, but had emptied himself first, that to come close to the divine one must be emptied too. The new confessions were not public. He invited the faithful one by one into the vestry behind the altar, where no one else was allowed. They entered in silence and returned hours later, changed. Some walked with limps that hadn't been there before. Some flinched at sudden sounds. A few emerged with wax-sealed letters pressed to their chests, which they were told to bury in their yards. One woman, who had once mocked the Reverend's teachings in whispers, came out of the vestry with her mouth stitched closed. Not by thread, but by fasting so severe her lips had split and fused. She never spoke again, but she smiled whenever she passed the church, like something inside her had been set right. Reverend Greaves said these rituals weren't punishments. They were gateways, He explained that the body holds noise, and the soul can only rise when that noise is stripped away. So he began teaching methods of silence, binding the arms to remove the temptation of movement, blindfolding the eyes to weaken the pull of the visible world, fasting for days to unburden the stomach and sharpen the inner voice. He created chambers below the chapel, small as coffins lined with cold stone. Those who entered were told they would feel nothing at first, only stillness. But over time their sins would peel away, and something cleaner would be left behind. Some came out shaking and radiant, claiming to have seen angels in the darkness. They spoke of whispers that became songs and of light that had no source but burnt behind the eyes. Others never came out at all. The Reverend said they had been taken by the Spirit, called home, chosen, completed. No one questioned it, not openly. But a boy named Ezra, whose mother had vanished during her confession week, dug behind the chapel one night and found a patch of soil that steamed even in the snow. He said he saw ropes hanging from the trees, nooses that hadn't been used but still swayed. 2 days later, Ezra was found at the riverbank, his mouth full of ash. His arms were tied behind his back with a cord that bore a small scrap of cloth, the same color as the altar curtain. After that, no one refused confession. They came in waves, each quieter than the last, and those who returned no longer looked one another in the eye. Reverend Greaves said the silence was spreading, and that was good. The valley had begun to understand. He said the louder the world screamed, the more sacred it was to simply listen. And the ones who listened long enough would finally hear what waited beneath. Micah Langley was born without sound. The world to him moved in tremors and flickers, not voices. He felt the weight of footsteps more than he ever understood words. But in a village so thick with silence, Micah was almost a mirror of it. Reverend Greaves had taken him under his wing early on, saying the boy's quiet spirit was proof of purity. Micah was given the task of ringing the church bell each morning, a duty he performed with shy devotion, climbing the rickety tower at dawn and pulling the rope in careful rhythm. The bell didn't just wake the town, it blessed it, the Reverend would say. Each chime shook away the night's sins. One morning in early spring, the bell rope wouldn't move. Micah tugged harder, but it stuck halfway as though caught on something below. Curious and unbound by fear in the way that only the young and disconnected can be. He made his way down into the rear of the church where the cord passed through a locked wooden panel behind the altar. He'd never been allowed past the curtain, but there was no one there to stop him now. The door had been left slightly ajar. Inside, the air was thick and warm, too warm. The scent wasn't rot, not exactly a puceau. It was something older, like a whetstone soaked in blood and left to steam. The room was small but deep. At first he saw only the shape of cloth draped over wooden forms, like mannequins left for display. But then the light caught flesh. Dozens of bodies, suspended from beams with wire and hooks, not nailed but hung like offerings, each one skinned in patches. Not haphazardly, but with precision. Strips of skin peeled back in spirals, crosses, and arcs. The flayed wounds were shaped like icons Micah had seen in stained glass. The kneeling, the crucified, the praying, their postures posed with care. Their mouths were sewn closed. Their eyes had been filled with wax. The rope from the bell passed through one of the bodies, pulled taut through a pierced shoulder, looping around the arm like sinew. When Micah touched it, the figure twitched as if remembering pain. He didn't scream. He couldn't, but he ran, stumbling backward through the curtain, past the altar, down the aisle, and into the woods. He didn't make it home. They found him at the river that night, curled at the edge of the bank, staring at the sky with eyes that no longer saw. He hadn't drowned. His clothes were dry, but he was catatonic, silent not from birth but now from something deeper, something spiritual, as though even his thoughts had been sealed shut. The rope from the chapel bell had been knotted around both ankles and frayed and burnt at the ends. The bells he once rang had been tied to his feet, rusted and cracked, hanging like broken prayers. After that, the bell never rang again. By the time the snow melted, the chapel garden had tripled in size. It stretched outward in silent defiance of the dying land around it, lush and vibrant, while the rest of the valley remained gray with frost-bitten weeds and lifeless crops. The villagers whispered that it had become a holy place, soil anointed, touched by something greater than rain. Reverend Greaves claimed the growth was due to prayer, but no one saw him water the rose or turn the earth. The ground seemed to breathe on its own. Elijah Coates wasn't the sort who prayed. A hunter by trade and older than most, he'd spent more nights in the forest than in his bed. He'd returned that spring with more traps than meat and more blisters than coins. Hunger makes a man think strange things. When his traps came back empty again, and the village turned colder despite the sun, Elijah wandered behind the chapel fence one morning, following the scent of sweet rot that clung to the garden like perfume. The vegetables were too perfect. The tomatoes held no blemish, and the carrots pulled easily from the ground, smooth as polished stone. But it was the soil beneath the southern row, thick and damp despite the sun, that drew his eye. He found a corner near the base of the church wall and began to dig, slow and careful, as if listening with his hands. It didn't take long. The first thing he unearthed was cloth, not sackcloth or farming burlap, but linen soaked in blackened stains. Beneath it came glass, shards with curved lips and gilded edges. The remains of communion chalices, shattered and buried like garbage. He set them aside carefully, but what he found next made his breath freeze. Bones, not scattered but layered. Rib cages pressed flat like broken baskets. Femurs with tiny grooves carved into them, each marked neat and deliberate, repeating in a pattern too exact for animals or decay. And at the center, wrapped in cloth still damp with old blood, was a jawbone split open and hollowed, its teeth stripped except for one, a gold molar filed to a point. Elijah recoiled, mouth dry. He reached for the bone to take it, to show someone, anyone. But before he could move, he felt something behind him. Not a sound, not a footstep, just presence. He was found the next day stumbling through the edge of the woods, his coat torn, his eyes bloodshot and unfocused. His mouth bled down his shirt in ropes. When the doctor arrived, Elijah tried to speak but only gurgled. His tongue had been severed at the root, not torn, not bitten, but cut with surgical accuracy. His fingers were burnt as if he'd tried to pull something from the fire. They asked him what had happened, but he could only sob and claw at the paper they gave him, unable to write a single word. The sheriff, tired of the murmurs, called it a bear attack. Said Elijah had been wandering drunk, that he'd triggered a trap or fought off a wild animal. But no animal left symbols carved in bone. No bear cut a man's tongue clean and left the rest of him untouched. No beast buried chalices like relics beneath vegetables. That week, Reverend Greaves held a prayer circle near the garden. He thanked the congregation for their loyalty and warned them that not all among them were pure. He said some had grown curious. That curiosity was a form of pride. He urged them to remain grounded in trust, in obedience, and in silence. He reminded them that the garden thrived because of their faith, and faith, he said, must be fed. After the service, a new patch of soil appeared near the garden's edge, darker than the rest, freshly turned. A crow circled above it once, then vanished into the clouds. The villagers didn't ask who it was for, but none of them walked past that corner again. And still, the tomatoes grew. They came just after the last frost, when the ground was soft enough to dig but cold enough to keep things preserved. A stranger arrived on horseback, cloaked and quiet, bearing only a small satchel and a name no one had spoken in over 2 decades. Her last name matched one of the disappeared, Maribel Harlan, a girl who'd fled the valley in 1836 after witnessing something behind the vestry door that shattered her mind. The stranger said she was her granddaughter, and she had come not out of vengeance but obligation. She carried no weapon, only a folded piece of parchment, yellowed and brittle, sealed with wax that had cracked over time. The seal bore a symbol, a spiral cut by a single straight line, the same mark carved into the old bones beneath the chapel garden. She read the testimony aloud in the chapel yard. It spoke of blood rites and quiet killings, of children buried beneath hymnals and mothers starved into visions. It described a sermon never spoken aloud, only etched into skin and hidden beneath the altar itself. The stranger claimed her grandmother had seen it once, in a moment of foolish courage, and had fled before the Reverend's gaze could root her to the floor like it had done to so many others. She'd written the testimony in hiding and passed it down with one instruction. When the garden blooms through snow, it means the altar is still hungry. The townsfolk had grown weary by then. Too many had vanished. Too many warnings had been explained away with scripture. So when the stranger asked for help, a handful followed. They entered the chapel at night, armed with pry bars and oil lamps, and together they approached the altar. The pulpit floor was heavier than it looked, bolted and layered with stone and lacquered wood. But they tore it open slowly, groaning with each plank as if disturbing something sacred. Beneath it was not a foundation but a passage, a downward tunnel of carved stone curved like the inside of a shell, spiraling into darkness. The walls were lined not with brick but with stretched flesh, tanned and nailed flat, stitched at the seams with thread made of something too fine to be string. Each section bore words etched by hand, burnt in with metal, in a language not recognized by any of them. But some sections were in English. Names, dates, sins, theft, lust, doubt, disobedience. Each word stood alone on its strip of flesh, as if naming the crime was enough to claim it forever. Some walls pulsed faintly as if something behind them still breathed. At the center of the chamber was a platform made of vertebrae, stacked and fused. Upon it knelt a figure draped in robes that had fused with the skin beneath. It was a body, but it hadn't decayed. The face was sunken, the lips peeled back in a half-smile, teeth bared in what might have been agony or praise. Its fingers were laced in prayer. The knees had calcified into the stone as if it had never moved. Its eyes were open, glassy, dry, but impossibly intact. And carved into the chest with lines that bled but never healed were the final words of Josiah Grieve's private gospel. The flock must empty itself to be filled. The stranger did not speak. She stepped forward and set her grandmother's parchment at the base of the platform. Then she turned to the others and told them to leave, that it was not yet over, but it could be buried. The townsfolk sealed the chamber in silence. They took bricks from the schoolhouse ruins and mortared the altar shut with salt and lime. They tore out the pews, burnt the hymnals, and let the church rot where it stood. But no one ever touched the garden. It continued to grow season after season, even when no one planted, even when no one prayed. It took 12 years for the state to acknowledge the land again. 12 years of silence, of overgrowth, of hollow stories passed between elders who refused to walk near the old chapel hill. Time had not buried what happened. It only wrapped it in layers of disbelief. Outsiders heard rumors and dismissed them as mountain superstition, a strange flare of religious hysteria in an ungoverned hollow. The official records mentioned rot in the foundation, illegal burial practices, and unsanctioned rites. Nothing criminal, nothing verified. The garden, though untouched, still bloomed every spring, and when state officials returned to inspect the grounds, they called it a miracle. They saw no bones, no parchment, no altar. Only fertile soil and a picturesque ruin of Gothic charm. So the state claimed it, filed permits, sent planners, declared the chapel a historical restoration initiative. Funding came from Richmond, workers came from neighboring towns. The pews were rebuilt, the windows were cleaned, the bell, long rusted and silent, was replaced with one that gleamed gold. Fresh lilies were planted where the garden once stood. They did not last the week, but the officials stayed the course. A new pastor was appointed, young, soft-spoken, and polite. Reverend Mark Cawley. He moved into the old rectory with his pregnant wife and 2-year-old daughter. He had no connection to Greaves, no knowledge of what had been sealed below. The chapel reopened in spring just as the wildflowers returned to the valley. The town was smaller now, quieter, but enough came to fill the first 3 rows. Cawley preached of unity, of forgiveness, of rebirth. His smile was real, his faith was real. He spoke plainly and with warmth, never raising his voice. People cried, they sang, and when the bell rang that evening, it echoed through the valley like a wound reopening. That night 2 children vanished, not from broken homes, not from the edges of town, but from pews. A brother and sister, ages 6 and 8. Last seen kneeling in prayer during the final hymn. Their mother had blinked and found their seats empty. The sheriff was called, but the chapel was clean. No sign of struggle, no fingerprints, no prints at all. Only 2 pairs of shoes were placed neatly at the altar's base, side by side, as if waiting to be filled again. The search stretched for days, then weeks. Dogs refused to enter the chapel. Crows gathered on the steeple, watching silently. The lilies wilted, then blackened. Reverend Cawley prayed harder. His sermons grew quieter. He told his wife he heard humming at night, low and layered, like voices practicing a song they didn't yet know. Then one morning he found the journal. It lay on the pulpit, dusty but intact, leather-bound, old but not rotted. He opened it. Inside were pages filled in long, sharp strokes, words written with precision as if etched rather than inked. It was the private gospel of Reverend Josiah Greaves. Not scripture, not sermons, notes, thoughts, calculations. Each entry is colder than the last. Descriptions of pain as offering, charts of human anatomy annotated with scripture, lists of names long since buried. In the back was a single blank page, or it had been, because now it bore a single line. Fresh ink. Still wet when Reverend Cawley touched it. The choir is incomplete. He closed the book and wept. He wept not out of fear but recognition, not memory but awakening. The chapel had not been exorcised, it had been paused. Josiah Greaves was not a ghost. He had never needed to haunt. He had planted something, not evil in the traditional sense, but obedience. A doctrine that lived in the beams and blood of the chapel itself. The next Sunday, fewer came. Whispers spread. The windows began fogging over during prayer. One child said they saw someone in the bell tower, a man without eyes humming a tune no one else heard. Cawley tried to resign. The letter was never sent. His daughter stopped speaking. And beneath the floorboards where new wood met old stone, something shifted. The chapel was sealed again, this time by official decree. Concrete was poured into the stairwell behind the altar, its spiral throat suffocated under layers of reinforced stone. The bell was taken down and placed in a museum 2 counties over. The stained glass was covered with protective boards and deemed too fragile for public restoration. Signs were posted. Historical property, no entry without permit. Most people assumed that would be the end of it. But even when sealed, even when stripped of pews and prayer and human presence, the church did not empty. It sat on the edge of the valley like a wound that refused to scar, growing darker with time instead of fading. No vandal ever dared break its windows. No teenagers lit candles inside it on dares. Every attempt to repaint its cracked exterior peeled away within days. The wooden boards warped back to their original weathered grain as if the place rejected modern tools. At night, neighbors heard the wind shift when it passed the chapel's peak. It sounded like breath through a hollow throat. A whistle, soft and patient. Years later, after the town had shrunk even more and only the oldest names remained, a memorial was erected just outside the chapel gates. It bore no scripture, only a plaque carved in simple iron, in memory of the unnamed. No ceremony marked its installation, no speeches, no flowers, just silence. Some say the workers who set the foundation wouldn't return the next morning. One claimed he saw hands beneath the soil, not moving, not reaching, just resting, as if waiting to be remembered. The government followed suit with quiet panic. A law was passed requiring routine inspections of religious properties across the state, not for structural decay, but for evidence of unregulated spiritual rituals. Another statute followed months later, this time federal, addressing the category of ritual abuse, a phrase that had never before appeared in official doctrine but now hovered like smoke in the corners of legal language. Schools began teaching signs of spiritual coercion. Mental health guidelines were updated, but none of it named the place in the valley directly. No one wanted to be the one to say the name aloud. Despite the warning signs and locked gates, people still came, not often, not loudly. But they came. The curious, the grief-stricken, the ones who didn't know why they'd driven there until they stepped out of their cars and felt the air tighten around their ribs. Many turned back. A few didn't. Some claimed the ground near the chapel vibrated slightly, like a slow heartbeat beneath their shoes. Others said they could hear singing, not music, but something like it, far below the earth, layered and soft, as though sung through mouths no longer attached to breath. Children especially responded strangely. They wandered toward the fence as if drawn by something unseen. Parents would catch them humming unfamiliar melodies in the car ride home. Tuneless, meandering lines that made the hair on the back of the neck rise. One girl began writing symbols she had never been taught, curling spirals and vertical slashes, shapes that matched those etched into bones once hidden beneath the church. Her mother burnt the notebook. The girl never wrote again. But sometimes, while brushing her hair, she would pause and whisper that she had a name in her mouth she wasn't allowed to say. None of the restoration workers ever returned. Some took other jobs. Others disappeared entirely. The Reverend Cawley family relocated under a witness protection program, though no charges were ever filed and no accusations were ever made. Just a quiet removal. He never preached again. His daughter eventually regained her speech, but never about what she saw. And her mother would later tell a friend in a moment of broken honesty that every mirror in their home had to be removed. The child kept seeing someone behind her. When scholars eventually gained limited access for documentation purposes, they found that the pulpit remained intact, untouched by time or rot. Not a single nail had loosened. Beneath it, the stone still retained a slight warmth. One of the researchers fainted upon touching the steps. He reported a vision, not of a face, but of a gesture. Hands bound in prayer. Skin flayed open, not in rage, but reverence. He refused to speak further. He left academia. His notes were never published. Today, the church remains sealed. No one disputes this. And yet every few years another report surfaces. A visitor missing, a sound caught on tape, a melody hummed by a stranger with no memory of where they heard it. Journalists visit, some brave enough to record, but the tapes come back warped. Batteries drain, cameras shut off at the gates. And always, there's that low frequency, barely audible, like a breath too long held. The town has tried to move on. New families arrive. They're told not to visit the chapel. They laugh it off and say they don't believe in ghost stories. But none of them ever set foot past the 3rd-mile marker. Mail carriers refuse to deliver up the old chapel road. The forest around it grows thick and unnatural, not lush, but overgrown in a way that suggests disuse or protection. Even the animals avoid it. The deer change course. The birds don't sing near the trees. And still, in the darkest hours before dawn, locals say you can see a pale light flickering through the upper window of the chapel. Not firelight, not electric. Just a faint glow, as if someone were praying, as if someone had never stopped. Evil is not always loud. It does not always come with thunder or flame. Sometimes it kneels. Sometimes it folds its hands and bows its head. Sometimes it waits with a smile and speaks only in whispers. Sometimes it builds a church and calls it home. What do you think? Could this happen again? Could this